At 8:20 in the morning on December 31st, 1942, German Vice Admiral Oskar Kummetz saw exactly what he needed to destroy an Allied convoy. Heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper and pocket battleship Lutzow, 6 destroyers, 8-inch guns that could rip through merchant hulls like paper. Convoy JW51B was 12 merchant ships carrying tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and supplies desperately needed by the Soviet Union. The escort was 5 British destroyers. Outgunned, outweighed. No chance in a straight fight. Kummetz had overwhelming firepower, tactical position, and the element of surprise in the gray Arctic dawn. One decision would determine whether those supplies reached Russia or went to the bottom of the Barents Sea. But that same decision would also determine the fate of Germany's entire surface fleet. Because 700 miles away in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler was waiting for news of a victory that would validate years of investment in battleships and cruisers. And he was not a patient man. The Arctic convoys were the lifeline keeping the Soviet Union in the war. After Germany invaded Russia in June 1941, Stalin's forces faced annihilation. Soviet industry was in chaos. Factories relocated eastward to escape German advance. Tank production plummeted. Aircraft numbers dwindled. The Red Army needed weapons, vehicles, ammunition, fuel, food. Britain and America sent it by sea. The route was brutal. Merchant ships sailed from Scotland or Iceland, rounded the northern tip of Norway, crossed the Barents Sea, and delivered cargo to Murmansk or Arkhangelsk, 1,200 miles through some of the worst waters on Earth. Winter darkness lasted 20 hours a day. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. Waves 30 feet high. Ice formed on superstructures, capsizing ships if not constantly cleared. And the Germans controlled Norway. U-boats prowled from bases at Narvik and Trondheim. Aircraft flew from Norwegian airfields. The Luftwaffe sank ships with bombs and torpedoes. U-boats hunted in wolf packs. But the greatest threat was the surface fleet. Germany had stationed powerful warships in Norwegian fjords specifically to destroy Arctic convoys. Battleship Tirpitz, sister ship to Bismarck. Heavy cruisers Admiral Hipper and Admiral Scheer. Pocket battleship Lutzow. These ships represented Germany's investment in surface naval power. Hitler believed battleships demonstrated national prestige and military strength. He wanted his navy to rival Britain's Royal Navy. But by late 1942, the German surface fleet had achieved little. If you're realizing this story goes beyond what's usually told about World War II convoys, hit that like button for Orders of History. We bring you the decisions that changed everything, with the details that matter. Tirpitz spent most of her time hiding in Norwegian fjords, a fleet in being that threatened convoys but rarely sailed. Smaller ships made occasional raids but achieved limited success. The most successful German surface operation against Arctic convoys had been in July 1942, when Tirpitz's mere movement toward convoy PQ-17 caused the Admiralty to order the convoy to scatter. Without escort protection, U-boats and aircraft slaughtered the scattered merchant ships. 24 of 35 ships sunk. Over 100 tanks lost. 200 aircraft destroyed. 3,000 vehicles at the bottom of the ocean. It was catastrophic. But Tirpitz never fired a shot. The threat alone was enough. Hitler saw this as validation of his surface fleet strategy. Keep powerful ships in Norwegian waters. Force the Allies to allocate resources to counter the threat. Occasionally, sortie to destroy convoys. The problem was that surface ships rarely actually sortied. German admirals were cautious. They knew their ships were valuable and difficult to replace. Losing a heavy cruiser would be a strategic disaster, so they waited for perfect conditions. Overwhelming advantage, minimal risk. By late 1942, Hitler was losing patience. He had invested enormous resources in battleships and cruisers, steel, labor, shipyard capacity. Those resources could have built hundreds of U-boats. If the surface fleet wasn't going to fight, what was the point? Convoy JW51B sailed from Loch Ewe, Scotland, on December 22, 1942. 14 merchant ships carrying war materials for Russia. The timing was deliberate. Winter darkness would protect them from German aircraft. U-boats were less effective in winter storms. The main threat was surface raiders. The escort was commanded by Captain Robert Sherbrook, Royal Navy, and destroyer HMS Onslow. Sherbrook was 41 years old, an experienced destroyer officer who understood convoy defense. His force was 6 destroyers: Onslow, Obedient, Obdurate, Orwell, Acades, and the Aging Bulldog. Also sailing independently, but intended to rendezvous with the convoy, was Rear Admiral Robert Burnett, with cruisers HMS Sheffield and HMS Jamaica, plus 2 destroyers. Burnett's force was designated Force R, distant cover that would join the convoy as it approached Russian waters. The convoy was sighted by German reconnaissance aircraft on Christmas Eve. U-354, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Karl-Heinz Herbschleb, shadowed the convoy on December 30th. Herbschleb radioed the position. Convoy of 6 to 10 merchant ships with possibly 1 cruiser and several destroyers, bearing east toward the Barents Sea. At German Naval Headquarters, Admiral Erich Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, saw an opportunity. This was exactly the scenario the surface fleet existed to exploit. Lightly escorted convoy, winter darkness, German heavy ships within striking distance. Raeder ordered Admiral Kummetz to sail immediately with Operation Rainbow. Kummetz would take heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper and 3 destroyers north of the convoy. Pocket battleship Lutzow and 3 destroyers would approach from the south. The plan was simple: sandwich the convoy between 2 powerful forces, destroy the escorts, then massacre the merchant ships at leisure. Admiral Hipper carried 8 8-inch guns and 12 4-inch guns. Lutzow carried 6 11-inch guns. Against this firepower, British destroyers with 4-inch or 4.7-inch guns had no chance in a gun duel. But Kummetz received one additional order that would prove fatal. The order came directly from Hitler's headquarters and read, "Procedure on meeting the enemy. Avoid a superior force, otherwise destroy according to the tactical situation. Use caution even against enemy of equal strength because it is undesirable for the cruisers to take any great risks." This was classic Hitler. He wanted results but feared losses. He wanted his admirals to be aggressive but not reckless. He wanted victories but couldn't accept casualties. The order was contradictory. Destroy the convoy, but don't risk the ships. An admiral could interpret this order in multiple ways. Aggressive commanders might read it as use tactical judgment. Cautious commanders might read it as withdraw if any risk appears. Kummetz was cautious. He had spent his career in a navy that punished failure severely. German admirals who lost ships were relieved, sometimes court-martialed. Kummetz knew Hitler's rage. He knew that returning with damaged ships might be worse than not sailing at all. So he intended to follow the letter of the order. Destroy the convoy if possible, but avoid risk to his heavy units. At 800 hours on December 31st, the situation was developing perfectly for Kummetz. Convoy JW51B was steaming east in single file through pack ice. 12 merchant ships, 6 destroyers in escort positions. The weather was typical Arctic winter. Overcast, poor visibility, temperature near 0. Kummetz's force approached from the north. Lutzow approached from the south. The British had no idea German heavy ships were hours away. At 8:20, the destroyer HMS Obdurate spotted ships to the south. Lieutenant Commander Charles Sclater reported to Sherbrook. Possible enemy vessels bearing south-southwest. Sherbrook ordered his destroyers to investigate. The spotted ships were Lutzo's destroyer screen. As Obdurate and Obedient moved to investigate, they came under fire. The engagement had begun. Sherbrook immediately recognized the danger. His destroyers were being drawn away from the convoy. German destroyers to the south meant German heavy ships somewhere nearby. This could be a trap. If German cruisers approached from another direction while his destroyers chased the southern force, the convoy would be defenseless. Sherbrook ordered smoke screens laid between the convoy and the threat. He turned his destroyers back toward the convoy. This decision saved the convoy. At 9:30, Admiral Hipper emerged from the northern gloom. She was massive, 14,000 tons, 8 8-inch guns, closing at 30 knots. Sherbrook was in destroyer Onslow, 1,800 tons, 4 4.7-inch guns. He ordered his destroyers to engage. It was suicide, but it was also doctrine. British destroyer doctrine was clear. When escorting a convoy against superior forces, the destroyers attack the threat to buy time for the convoy to escape. The destroyer crews accepted they probably wouldn't survive. They attacked anyway. Onslow, Orwell, Obedient, and Obdurate charged Admiral Hipper. 4 destroyers against a heavy cruiser. They fired their 4.7-inch guns, knowing the shells could barely scratch Hipper's armor. But they threatened torpedoes. Each destroyer carried 8 torpedoes. If any of those torpedoes hit Admiral Hipper, the 8-inch armor belt might not protect vital spaces. A torpedo could cripple the cruiser, flood engine rooms, jam steering. Kumitz saw the destroyers charging. He knew they were preparing to launch torpedoes. He remembered his orders: avoid great risks. Admiral Hipper turned away. The turn was temporary, just long enough to avoid the torpedo threat. But it gave Sherbrook precious minutes. The convoy altered course away from the threat, hiding in smoke and weather. The engagement continued. Sherbrook maneuvered his destroyers aggressively, constantly threatening torpedo attacks, forcing Kumitz to turn away repeatedly. Admiral Hipper's 8-inch guns fired at the weaving destroyers. At 9:40, a shell hit Onslow's bridge. The explosion killed several men instantly. Shell fragments ripped through Sherbrook's face. He lost an eye. Blood poured down his uniform. He could barely see, but he remained on the bridge, giving orders for another 20 minutes before blood loss forced him to go below. Before leaving the bridge, Sherbrook radioed his situation to the next senior officer and ordered, "Continue to engage the enemy." Commander Kinloch, in Obedient, took command and continued the attack. Destroyer Achates was hit repeatedly, set on fire, eventually sinking, but the destroyers kept fighting. For nearly 2 hours, 5 British destroyers fought off 2 German heavy ships and 6 destroyers. It shouldn't have been possible. Admiral Hipper alone had more firepower than all 5 British destroyers combined. But Sherbrook's aggressive tactics created the illusion of greater strength than actually existed. Every time Hipper moved toward the convoy, destroyers charged, threatening torpedoes. Every time Kumitz turned to engage the destroyers, they disappeared into smoke. The convoy scattered in the confusion, making it harder to target. At 11:30, the situation changed. 2 British cruisers appeared from the east. HMS Sheffield and HMS Jamaica, under Rear Admiral Burnett, had been sailing independently to rendezvous with the convoy. Burnett heard the gunfire and increased speed toward the battle. When Sheffield and Jamaica appeared, Kumitz faced new calculations. Sheffield carried 12 6-inch guns. Jamaica carried 12 6-inch guns. Admiral Hipper's 8-inch guns outranged the British 6-inch guns, but not by much. More importantly, Cummins didn't know if more British ships were nearby. He could see 2 cruisers. Were there more behind them? Was this the vanguard of a larger force? His orders echoed in his mind. Avoid superior force. Use caution even against equal strength. 2 British cruisers plus 5 destroyers probably constituted equal strength. Engaging them would certainly involve risk. At 11:37, Cummins made his decision. He ordered his forces to withdraw. Admiral Hipper turned west. Lutzow, which had been maneuvering south of the convoy but never effectively engaged, also withdrew. The German destroyers formed up and followed. The battle was over. Convoy JW51B continued toward Russia. All 12 merchant ships survived. 1 British destroyer, a Chatas, was sunk. Destroyer Onslow was damaged. Casualties were 31 killed, several wounded including Sherbrook. German casualties were minimal. Destroyer Friedrich Eckholt was sunk by Jamaica, mistaking the British cruiser for Admiral Hipper in poor visibility. Otherwise, the German force was undamaged. Tactically, it was nearly a draw. Strategically, it was a British victory because the convoy survived. But the real consequences were about to unfold 700 miles away. Adolf Hitler learned about the battle from BBC Radio. The British Broadcasting Corporation announced that a German attack on an Arctic convoy had been repulsed by the Royal Navy. Hitler was furious that he learned about German naval operations from enemy radio. He demanded an immediate report from the Kriegsmarine. The report took hours to compile and transmit. Hitler's fury grew with every delayed minute. When Admiral Theodor Kranke, the Navy's liaison officer at Hitler's headquarters, finally brought preliminary reports, Hitler exploded. The operation had failed. Heavy ships with overwhelming firepower had been driven off by destroyers. 12 merchant ships full of supplies for Stalin had reached Russia untouched. The surface fleet had again proven useless. Hitler summoned Grand Admiral Raeder to his headquarters on January 6, 1943. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. It was one of Hitler's most famous tirades. Witnesses reported that Hitler's face turned red, veins stood out on his neck, he screamed and pounded the table. He declared that the surface fleet was completely useless. The ships accomplished nothing. They consumed fuel, steel, and trained personnel that could be better used elsewhere. The officers were cowards who refused to fight. The entire surface fleet would be decommissioned and scrapped. Battleships Tirpitz, Scharnhorst, and Gneisenau would be broken up. Heavy cruisers would be dismantled. Light cruisers would be retired. The guns would be removed and installed in coastal fortifications. The steel would be melted down. The crews would be transferred to U-boats or to the army. Henceforth, Germany's naval strategy would focus entirely on submarines. The surface fleet was finished. Raeder tried to argue. He pointed out that the surface fleet tied down British resources. The Royal Navy had to keep battleships and cruisers in home waters to counter Tirpitz. The mere threat of German surface raiders forced the Allies to provide heavy escorts for convoys. Without the surface fleet, those British ships could deploy elsewhere, perhaps to the Pacific or Mediterranean. Hitler wouldn't listen. He had made his decision. Raeder could submit a report defending the fleet if he wished, but the decision was final. Raeder left the meeting and immediately began writing a detailed memorandum defending the surface fleet. He argued passionately that scrapping the fleet would be a strategic disaster. He submitted the report. Hitler rejected it. On January 30th, 1943, Raeder resigned. He had commanded the Kriegsmarine since 1928, building it from a small coastal force to a blue water navy. Now, Hitler was ordering it destroyed. Raeder couldn't carry out the order and maintain his honor. He resigned and was replaced by Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet. Dönitz was more politically skilled than Raeder. He met with Hitler and gradually talked him back from the most extreme position. The large ships wouldn't be immediately scrapped, but they would be decommissioned and placed in reserve status. They would no longer conduct offensive operations. Resources would shift to U-boats. In practical terms, this meant the German surface fleet ceased to be an offensive force. Tirpitz remained in Norwegian waters but conducted no more operations against convoys. She was eventually sunk by RAF bombers in November 1944. Scharnhorst made one final sortie in December 1943 and was sunk by HMS Duke of York. Other heavy ships were gradually retired, scrapped, or destroyed by Allied bombing. The German surface fleet that Hitler had invested billions of Reichsmarks to build effectively ended on December 31, 1942. Not because of a decisive naval battle, not because of overwhelming Allied superiority, but because Admiral Kummetz made one decision: to withdraw rather than risk his ships against what he perceived as equal or possibly superior force. That single decision, driven by cautious orders and fear of Hitler's reaction to losses, triggered Hitler's rage and led to the destruction of Germany's entire surface fleet strategy. Captain Robert Sherbrook survived his wounds and was awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions defending Convoy JW51B. The citation read, "By his superb leadership and inspired handling of his forces, Captain Sherbrook drove off an attack by a greatly superior enemy force and saved the convoy from destructive." He lost the sight in one eye but returned to service and commanded a light cruiser later in the war. The merchant ships of Convoy JW51B delivered their cargo to the Soviet Union: tanks, aircraft, ammunition, vehicles that helped the Red Army continue fighting. Admiral Kummetz survived the war. He was never court-martialed for his performance at the Barents Sea, but he was quietly reassigned to less important duties. The Battle of the Barents Sea became a case study in naval tactics. It demonstrated that aggressive destroyer tactics could neutralize superior forces through bold maneuver and constant threat. It showed that tactical caution, even when backed by overwhelming firepower, could lead to strategic defeat. And it proved that leaders' decisions are shaped as much by their fears and constraints as by the tactical situation before them. Kummetz had the force to destroy the convoy. He had the position, the firepower, and the opportunity, but he also had orders to avoid risk, and he had knowledge of what Hitler did to admirals who failed or lost ships. That knowledge drove his decision more than the tactical situation. One decision: withdraw rather than engage. That decision saved 12 merchant ships, cost 31 British sailors their lives, sunk 1 German destroyer, and doomed Germany's entire surface fleet to irrelevance and eventual destruction. The irony is profound. Kummetz withdrew to avoid losing ships. His withdrawal led Hitler to order all the ships scrapped anyway. The caution intended to preserve the fleet destroyed it. We've just walked through one of the most consequential naval decisions of World War II, a moment when choosing not to fight had consequences far beyond a single battle. If this story showed you how individual decisions ripple through history, share it with someone who appreciates military history. Subscribe to Orders of History so you never miss these moments when single choices changed everything. Drop a comment. Did you know that one cautious decision by a German admiral led Hitler to essentially scrap his entire surface fleet? Or have you always wondered why Germany's battleships and cruisers seemed to disappear after 1943? The surface fleet Germany had spent decades building, that Hitler had invested billions to create, that was supposed to challenge British naval supremacy, ended not in a climactic battle, but in one admiral's decision to turn away from a fight he thought he might lose. And in turning away from that fight, he lost something far greater than a battle. He lost the fleet.